3 years ago, I ordered a book online. Used copy, $7 and change. It was a biography of Spinoza by a man named Stephen Nadler, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, who's probably written more about Spinoza's life than anyone alive. I wasn't expecting much. I'd read about Spinoza before, the broad strokes, excommunication at 23, the ethics, the lens grinding, the ban. But I hadn't read the chapter about how he died. I hadn't sat with the details. The book arrived on a Wednesday. I started reading it that night at my desk after dinner, with the lamp on and a cup of coffee that went cold before I noticed. By 11 o'clock, I'd made it to the chapter about Spinoza's final months, and something in that chapter stopped me the way a hand stops a clock. Not a dramatic revelation, not a shocking twist, a detail, a small, specific, human detail. When Spinoza knew he was dying, he gave an instruction. He told someone close to him, if anything happens to me, take my desk to Amsterdam. Don't wait, don't ask permission. Take the desk. The desk, not a vault, not a safe. A wooden desk in a rented room in The Hague, covered in papers and ink stains and lens dust. That desk held the Ethics, the most dangerous philosophical text of the 17th century. It held an unfinished political treatise, a Hebrew grammar, 74 letters to and from some of the sharpest minds in Europe, an entire life's work sitting on a piece of furniture that you could buy at a market for a few guilders. I sat there in my office in Knoxville at midnight, reading about a man who lived 350 years ago in a city I've never visited, and I couldn't stop thinking about that instruction. Take my desk. Because he knew that if the wrong people got to that desk before his friends did, everything on it would be burned. Every page, every proof, every word he'd spent his life trying to get right. And that's when something shifted for me. Not in my head, in my chest. Because I realized I'd been thinking about Spinoza wrong. I'd been thinking about him the way most people think about him. As a philosopher, a thinker, a man of ideas. But in that moment, reading about the desk, I started thinking about him as a man who was afraid. Not afraid of dying. Afraid that the truth would die with him. Afraid that everything he'd written would end up in a fireplace somewhere. And afraid enough to put his trust in 3 people, 3 friends, and hope they would run. This is what happened. Baruch Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632 to a family of Portuguese Jewish merchants who had fled the Inquisition. His community was tight, close-knit, Sephardic Jews who'd escaped torture and forced conversion in Portugal and Spain, and who'd built a life in Amsterdam that was precarious but proud. They had a synagogue, they had schools, they had rules, and they expected their young men to follow them. Spinoza didn't follow them. By his early 20s, he was asking questions that made the rabbis uncomfortable. Not rude questions, not provocative for the sake of it. Genuine questions about the text. He wanted to know why Genesis told the creation story twice with different details. He wanted to know why Moses described his own death in Deuteronomy. He wanted to know how a book supposedly written by one man could contain contradictions that a careful student would notice on a first reading. On July 27, 1656, the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam issued a cherem against Baruch Spinoza, an excommunication, and not a gentle one. The text of the cherem is one of the harshest ever recorded by that community. It reads in part, "The Lords of the Council make known that having long known of the evil opinions and acts of Baruch de Spinoza, they have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways. They pronounce that the said Spinoza should be excommunicated and expelled from the people of Israel. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. No one should communicate with him, neither in writing nor accord him any favor, nor stay with him under the same roof, nor come within 4 cubits in his vicinity." 4 cubits, that's about 6 feet. At 23 years old, Spinoza was forbidden from standing within 6 feet of any member of his own community. His family could not speak to him. His friends could not write to him. He left Amsterdam, changed his first name from Baruch, the Hebrew, to Benedict, the Latin. Same meaning, blessed, a different language for a man starting a different life. He settled eventually in The Hague, in a rented room in the home of a family named Van der Spijk. And he learned a trade, lens grinding, polishing glass by hand for microscopes and telescopes hour after hour. The work paid little. The glass dust filled his lungs. And in the quiet hours between the grinding, he wrote, "There's an irony there that I've never been able to let go of." Spinoza spent his days making lenses, instruments designed to let people see things more clearly, to bring distant objects closer, to magnify what the naked eye couldn't grasp. And the dust from that work, the fine silica particles from polishing glass that helped others see, that dust was slowly destroying his lungs. The thing that let others see was killing the man who made it. He gave people vision, and it cost him his breath. In 1670, Spinoza published a book. Or rather, someone published a book. The title page said it was printed in Hamburg by a publisher named Henricus Kunrath. Both were lies. The book was printed in Amsterdam by a man named Jan Rieuwertsz. The author's name appeared nowhere on it. The book was the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, and it was in the most literal sense a forbidden gospel. Not a gospel in the sense of Matthew or Mark or Luke, something more dangerous than any single text. A gospel of method, a way of reading sacred scripture that, once you understood it, made it impossible to read the Bible the same way again. Spinoza's central claim was devastating in its simplicity. He said the Bible should be studied the same way you study nature. You don't start with what the church tells you a river does. You go to the river, you measure the current, you test the water. And if what you find contradicts what the church says, you don't change the river, you change your understanding. He applied that method to the first 5 books of the Bible, the books traditionally attributed to Moses, and he demonstrated, passage by passage, contradiction by contradiction, that Moses could not have written them. Not all of them, not most of them. The books contained multiple voices, multiple authors, writing in different centuries with different vocabularies, different theologies, different assumptions about who God was and what he wanted. Someone had stitched them together, and the stitching was visible to anyone willing to look. He showed that Deuteronomy chapter 34 describes Moses' death and burial and asked the obvious question that no one was supposed to ask. How does a man write the account of his own death and the details of his own funeral? He showed that Genesis chapter 12 refers to a place called Dan that didn't receive that name until centuries after Moses was supposed to have lived. He showed that Numbers chapter 12 verse 3 calls Moses the humblest man on the face of the earth, and asked whether the humblest man on the face of the earth would write that about himself. These weren't attacks, they were observations. Spinoza was reading the Bible the way a detective reads a crime scene, not to destroy the evidence, to understand who put it there. Stephen Nadler called his study of the Tractatus a book forged in hell. That wasn't Nadler's phrase. It was what the religious authorities of the 17th century called it. Every denomination, every tradition, they all agreed on one thing. This book had to be destroyed. In 1673, the Dutch Reformed Church's Synod of Dordrecht publicly condemned the Tractatus. In 1674, the Provincial High Court of Holland, Zeeland, and West Friesland officially banned it. Anyone caught selling it, distributing it, or possessing it faced prosecution. And Rieuwertsz, the publisher, kept printing it. He put false titles on the covers. He swapped the names of fake cities and fake publishers on every new edition. He printed new copies and slipped them into the world like letters under a locked door. That's what the forbidden gospel was. Not a dusty scroll pulled from a cave, a living, breathing analysis that said, look at the words on the page. Really look at them. And when you do, you'll see that the men who wrote them were exactly that. Men. With agendas. With politics. With reasons for choosing this word instead of that one. And the fact that they were men does not make what they wrote worthless. It makes what they wrote human. And the human part is the part the church has been trying to erase for 2,000 years. Now let me tell you about the 3 friends. When you are excommunicated at 23, and your own family can't stand within 6 feet of you, friendship becomes something different. It's not a social convenience, it's not someone to split a meal with or complain about the weather to. It's survival. And Spinoza had 3 men in his life who were not just friends. They were the reason his words exist today. The first was Jarik Jellis. Jellis was a spice merchant in Amsterdam who walked away from his business in his 30s. Not because it was failing, because he'd started reading philosophy and couldn't stop. He met Spinoza through Amsterdam's intellectual circles, and something clicked. Gelles wasn't a scholar. He was a merchant who put his money where his mind was. He helped fund the publication of the Tractatus with his own savings, backing a man the authorities wanted silenced. The second was Lodewijk Meyer, a physician with a practice in Amsterdam and a parallel life as a writer. Meyer could move between worlds, medicine and banned philosophy without drawing attention. He understood Spinoza's arguments at a depth few others could. After Spinoza's death, it was Meyer who wrote the preface to the collected works and translated it from Dutch into Latin so it could reach scholars across Europe. He was the bridge between Spinoza's mind and the world that needed it. The third was Jan Rieuwertsz, the publisher, a small printing operation in Amsterdam, not wealthy, not connected. What he was brave in a way that most people never have to be. He published the Tractatus, knowing it would be banned. He printed it with a false title page. When the church condemned it, he printed it again. When the provincial court outlawed it, he kept copies moving through underground channels. And here's a detail that still gets me. 18 years after Spinoza died, in May of 1695, Rieuwertz's own son was arrested for selling Spinoza's works. The son, 18 years later. The father had risked his freedom to publish a dead philosopher's words, and a generation later, the son was being dragged into court for continuing what his father started. In the same month, another bookseller named Timotheus ten Hoorn was arrested and fined for the same offense, selling Spinoza, in 1695. The man had been dead for nearly 2 decades, and people were still going to jail for putting his words into other people's hands. These were the three: a merchant who gave up his livelihood for philosophy, a doctor who worked in 2 languages to make dangerous ideas legible, a publisher who went to press when going to press meant going to prison. They weren't disciples. They weren't followers in any religious sense. They were men who'd read something that changed how they thought, and they decided that what they'd read was more important than their own safety. By 1676, Spinoza was dying. He knew it. The tuberculosis that had been eating at his lungs for years, maybe decades, was winning. Colerus, one of his earliest biographers, who actually lived in the same house as the Van der Speyk family and had first-hand access to the people who knew Spinoza, noted that he had been consumptive for a long time. His cough was getting worse. His body was getting lighter. The man who'd spent decades grinding lenses in a closed room, breathing fine glass dust with every stroke of the polishing wheel, was paying for every lens he'd ever made. But he didn't stop working. The Ethics was finished, his masterwork. 5 parts. Definitions, axioms, propositions, proofs, all laid out in geometric order like a mathematician proving the nature of God, the structure of the mind, the mechanics of human emotion, and the meaning of freedom. It was the single most important philosophical text of the 17th century, and it sat on his desk in a rented room in The Hague because it was too dangerous to publish while he was alive. He tried. In 1675, he'd begun preparing the Ethics for publication. Word leaked, the theologians heard, threats gathered like weather. Spinoza pulled the manuscript back. He wrote to a friend, "At this point, I have resolved to put off publishing until such time as I could do so without fear." That time never came. The book went back to the desk, and the desk stayed in the rented room. He was also working on a political treatise, the Tractatus-Politicus, which he never finished. The final chapter breaks off mid-sentence. He was writing about democracy, about the rights of citizens to govern themselves. The last word he put on that page was a Latin term for civic rights, and then the sentence just stops. He died before he could finish the thought. There's something about that unfinished sentence that won't leave me alone. A man writing about freedom, about the right of ordinary people to have a voice in how they're governed. And death takes the pen out of his hand before he can complete the argument. In early February of 1677, with the cough getting worse and his weight dropping, Spinoza made his final arrangements. Some accounts place his last instructions to friends at roughly 11 days before his death. Others are less precise about the dates. What's certain is this: in those final weeks, Spinoza knew what was coming, and he made a choice about what mattered. Not his comfort, not his legacy in any personal sense, the work, the arguments. The proofs that had cost him his family, his community, his health. He wanted them to survive. Take my desk. Everything on it. Get it to Rieuwertsz in Amsterdam. Don't wait. I found the detail about the unfinished sentence on a Thursday night, sitting at my own desk, scrolling through a university archive. I read the line about the Tractatus-Politicus breaking off in the middle of a thought about democracy, and I stopped scrolling. I looked up from the screen. My office was quiet. The house was dark except for the desk lamp. And I looked at my own desk the way you look at something you've seen 1,000 times but never really noticed. The 4 Bibles with their colored tabs, the legal pads full of notes, the printouts from journals and online archives with my handwriting cramped in the margins. A cold cup of coffee I'd stopped drinking hours ago. My wife's picture on the shelf, looking at me from behind a stack of books. I thought, if I died tomorrow, if something happened in the night, what would happen to this desk? Who would come for these pages? My brother hasn't spoken to me in years. My daughter-in-law doesn't want me talking about the Bible near the grandchildren. The folks at my old church think I've lost my mind. Spinoza had 3 friends who would run for his desk. I sat there in the lamplight, and I wasn't sure I had one. February 21st, 1677. A Sunday. The Hague. The day before, a Saturday, Spinoza had seemed well enough. Well for him. Well enough to sit up. Well enough to talk. The Van der Spijk family, his landlords, had gone to church that morning. A Sunday routine. And when they returned in the afternoon, Georg Hermann Schuller was already there. Schuller was a physician. He was also part of Spinoza's extended circle. A man who corresponded with Leibniz and who served as a kind of intermediary between the dying philosopher and the wider world of European thought. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Baruch Spinoza died. He was 44 years old. There was no family at the bedside. His parents were long dead. His brother and sister had not spoken to him since the excommunication, 21 years of silence. The community that had cursed him in 1656, cursed be he by day and cursed be he by night, had kept their word for 2 decades. He died in a rented room in a house that wasn't his, in a city he'd moved to because no other place would fully have him, with a doctor beside him and his landlord's family at church. He left no will. There was nothing to leave. He owned no property. He had no savings to speak of. What he had was on the desk. 4 days later, on February 25th, they buried him at the Nieuwe Kerk, the new church, in The Hague. Not in a permanent grave, not in a family plot, in a rented vault. Even in death, Spinoza owned nothing. The vault was near the resting place of Johan de Witt, the Grand Pensionary of Holland, the most powerful political figure in the Dutch Republic, who had been lynched by a mob in 1672. De Witt had believed in a republic governed by reason, not by princes. He'd argued that citizens, not kings, should decide how they were governed. The mob that killed him dragged his body through the streets. 2 men who believed in reason. One killed by a mob, one killed by dust and disease, both buried in the same church. De Witt's death was public, violent, a spectacle of rage. Spinoza's was quiet, private. A man coughing his last breath into a handkerchief in a rented room on a Sunday afternoon. But they were both destroyed for the same reason. They said something true in a world that preferred the lie. And now, the clock started. The moment Spinoza was gone, his friends moved. We don't know exactly who packed the desk. We don't know whether Schuller did it himself that Sunday evening, or whether he sent word to Amsterdam and someone came for it. What we know is that the desk, with all of Spinoza's papers, every manuscript, every letter, every unfinished page, was removed from the rented room in The Hague and transported to Amsterdam. Records show it arrived at Rieuwertz's shop by late March in the 17th century, with roads that were frozen mud in February and the constant threat that church or civil authorities would hear about the dead philosopher's papers and move to confiscate them. His friends got everything out. They moved with the kind of urgency that only comes when you know exactly what you're carrying and exactly what happens if you lose it. And then, in Amsterdam, behind closed doors, the real work began. Gelles wrote the preface. Meyer translated it into Latin. Rieuwertsz set the type. Schuller edited. A professional translator named Glazemaker rendered the Latin into Dutch for ordinary readers. All of them worked in secrecy. All of them knew that what they were doing could land them in prison. They had no protection, no patron, no government backing, just a merchant, a doctor, a publisher, and a translator, working in back rooms in Amsterdam, racing to get the words of a dead man into print before anyone came for the pages. In roughly 9 months, they did it. 2 volumes published simultaneously. The opera Posthuma in Latin and De Nagelate Schriften in Dutch. The author identified only by his initials. BDS, Benedictus de Spinoza. No full name, no portrait, no city of publication listed. The contents changed European thought forever. The Ethics complete, published for the first time. The unfinished Tractatus-Politicus, breaking off mid-sentence. A Hebrew grammar. 74 letters. A written record of one of the most extraordinary minds of the 17th century. The books were banned almost immediately. Church and state, for once, agreed. But by then it was too late. The copies were already moving. Amsterdam, London, Paris, the German states. You can ban a book. You can arrest the bookseller. You can fine the printer's son 18 years later. But if the book has already been read, the ban is just noise. The signal has already arrived. Elaine Pagels, who spent her career studying the texts the church tried hardest to destroy, has written about this pattern. Suppressed texts survive precisely because they are suppressed. The act of banning creates curiosity. The act of burning creates legend. The Nag Hammadi library sat in a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert for 16 centuries because someone decided it was worth hiding. Spinoza's work survived because a handful of people in Amsterdam decided they were worth going to prison for. The original manuscripts are mostly gone. The pages used to set the type disappeared after printing. What we read today is a copy of what those friends preserved in the months after a man died in a rented room. Every edition of the Ethics in every language on earth traces back to that desk. And that desk traces back to 3 friends who decided to run. I think about that desk sometimes. Not Spinoza's. Mine. I think about it late at night when the house is quiet. Books with cracked spines and yellow sticky notes. Printouts with my handwriting in the margins. My wife's picture on the shelf. Spinoza's desk was not so different. Papers and ink and dust. The only real difference is scale. What was on his desk changed how human beings think about God and freedom. What's on mine changes only me. But here's what I keep coming back to. Spinoza was excommunicated at 23. He lived alone for 21 years. He never married. He never had children. He rented every room he ever slept in and was buried in a rented vault in a church he didn't belong to. He died at 44, coughing blood, with glass dust in his lungs and the most important philosophical work of his century, sitting unpublished on a desk that could have been confiscated at any moment by anyone who decided his words were too dangerous to exist. And he kept writing. Every day he kept grinding lenses to pay the rent, and then sitting down at that desk to work on the proofs and the arguments and the letters to friends who risked their reputations and their freedom just by opening the envelope. He kept telling the truth about the texts that everyone around him had agreed to leave unquestioned. I lost a bowling partner over a translation. Spinoza lost his family, his community, his health, and eventually his life. The scale isn't even close. I mention my small sacrifices on this channel sometimes. The brother who won't call, the people at church who crossed the street, the dinner invitations that stopped coming, and I'm not diminishing those. They hurt. They still hurt. But then I read about a man who was told at 23 that no one in his community could come within 6 feet of him for the rest of his life, and who responded by writing the most important book of his century in a rented room that smelled like glass dust. And I think about what courage actually looks like. It doesn't look like a soldier on a battlefield. It doesn't look like a politician at a podium. It looks like a sick man in a rented room, handing a stack of papers to 3 friends and saying, "Please, make sure this survives me." 350 years later, it did. The Ethics is still in print. The Tractatus is still in print. The letters are still being read by scholars and retired history teachers who stumble onto a used copy at a library sale and crack it open on a Wednesday night and don't close it until Thursday morning. The desk is gone, the rented room is gone, the man is gone, but the words are still here. And that's the part of the story that won't let me sleep. Not the death, not the excommunication, not the banned books or the arrested booksellers or the rented grave. The part that keeps me up is simpler than all of that. He trusted 3 people with everything he had, and they didn't let him down. That's all Spinoza was doing. That's all any of us are doing. Finding something true, holding it carefully, and hoping that when the time comes, the people we trust will carry it forward. The word survived, and they're still here on the page in the language, waiting for whoever's willing to look.